pleasant day to everyone. A pleasant day to our professor, Mr. Janus Raymond Tan. Together with my team, Mr. Albay Jan Christian, Miss Almodovar Rinoa Cyril, Mr. Bariring Paul Gabriel, Mr. Dolor Charlie, Mr. Humarang Leo Rodri, Miss Rabino Noelia Jane, and Miss Roman Patricia May. We are going to present our midterm project in CCS 108, Object-Oriented Programming, about university or school registration of students and subjects. And the first presenter to run the program and to show the flow, may we call on Miss Renoa Cyril Almodovar.
Thank you, Leo. So let's try to run the program. My name is Rinoa Cyril Almodovar, and let me show you what it looks like when we first run the program. The program for university registration of students and subjects will let you choose among the following 8 options. First option lets you create a new student record, and option 2 will let you create a new subject record. Option 3 lets you enlist a subject to a student, and option 4 removes a subject from a student. Option 5 will display the updated details of a student, and option 6 displays all the details of a student. Option 7 displays all student details enlisted in a selected subject, and option 8 is for exit, which will terminate the program.
Okay, Miss. Thank you so much, Miss Renoa Cyril. May we call on Miss Noela Jane Rabino for the class timer.
So I'm Noela Rabino, and this is our class diagram wherein it shows the relationship of a student and subject. Notice the straight line between classes to indicate association as the type of relationship. Multiplicities such as 0 to many are used in this example. The relationship will be read as follows. First is from student to subject class perspective. Every student may or may not have subject or subjects as shown in the diagram. In real-world scenario, taking a particular subject depends on the course that the student takes. For example, computer programming is not applicable for a psychology student, but all first-year students in college must take understanding the self subject. To allow us to record multiple subject objects in a single student subject, we define a list subjects collection and a method add subject having the data type subject and variable subject to store subject details every time we will call the method. Add subject will be the method to use in order to check whether a subject to add is already enlisted in subject record. If the subject to add is not enlisted to a student, the add subject adds new student to the list subjects collection. If not, an error message will be printed saying that the subject was already enlisted in the student records. In the student parameterized constructor, we only accept the values for first name, last name, and course. The next one is from student to student class perspective. Every subject may or may not have a student or students as shown in the diagram. In real-world scenario, enlisting of subject was first done having no students at all. It will only have a student once they have enrolled and assigned to take those subjects. A student may have multiple subjects as long as it is not the same. To allow us record multiple objects in a single subject object, we define a list students collection and a method add students, data type student, and variable student to store student details every time we will call the method. Add student will be the method to use in order to check whether a student to add is already enlisted in subject record. If the student to add is not enlisted to a particular subject, the add student adds the new student to the list students collection. If not, an error message will be printed saying that the student was already enlisted in the subject records. In the, in the subject parameterized constructor, we only accept values for subject ID, subject name, and units. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Miss Rabino. Up next to present is Miss Patricia Mirman for the code of the subject class.
In subject class, you will see the private fields in subject ID, string subject name, and in units, which are the attributes of a subject. The private list student will be the code that will collect the information of student once they were added. These are the constructors. The public string getSubjectDetails is a method that will return the value of the subject details. The method public void addStudent, which is void, shows that it has no return type. Public string getStudentPlease is the method that will return the student please. And lastly, these are the getters that will enable you to access the private attributes. That's all.
Next to present about the student class, may we call on Mr. Charlie Dolor.
This is the class that we use to define a student. And here we have private attributes or fields, the student ID, the first name string, last name string, and of course is a string also in a private accessibility. Then to have multiple subjects, we define a collection list subjects which will accept only subject objects. And here we have the constructor, parameterized constructor that puts value to the fields. And here we have the add subject method in a void, which means it does not return anything. And here this is where the association of this class occurred. In every addition or enlistment of subjects, there will be the addition of the object in the list of subjects. And in every addition of the subject to that student, this student class will be added to the list here defined in the subject class. That's why it is this keyword, which means this whole class will be added to the subject class, to the list of students. And here we have the public method getStudentDetails to return the string values of the properties, and getSubjectList. This is where the method returns the details of the subject that is a student enrolled. And this is the getter methods of the class, to which will be used in the program. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Charlie Dolor. May we call on Ms. Noella Jane Rabino for the remaining codes before the selections.
sa main program po. So in main program, we have imported the buffered reader, input-output exception, input stream reader, array list, and list, as this will be used in order to execute some of our operations. We also created a list object for student and subject class. You will know that it is the main program if you see the entry point, public static void main string arguments. The throws number format exception, input-output exception, is used in order to take only a integer value from the user input by using the buffered reader. We declared a variable selected having int as data type that will store selected value in the menu. While loop is used, which means that the loop will always continue to ask for what operation the user wanted to do, but will only stop if and only if you choose the selection 8, which is the exit that will terminate the program. Entering a value less than 0 or greater than 8 will show an error message. Try and catch was used to catch input errors inside the selections, and these are the 8 selections that the user will choose for what operation he or she wanted to do. The next presenter will explain each of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Noela Jen Rabino. I'm Mr. Leo Rodrigo Marang to present to you the first two options. First option, option 1, is to create new record for the student. First is to enter the student ID. Only integer data type is allowed. Second, string data type for first name followed by last name and then course. Once entered, registered will be printed. Let's look at the code of option 1 or selection 1. So, the menu catalog will be printed for the user to choose from option 1 to option 8. Next, the program will accept the input, which is in data type string. Sorry, excuse me. And then we will going to parse the input into integer. Next is to create the new student record. If we selected option 1, this is going to, what will going to happen if the student bank or there is no student in the student bank. If student bank doesn't have any students yet, we have to fill up the student class fields. We have to enter the student ID, enter the student first name, student's last name, and student course. Next, we instantiated a student object inside the class with the fields of the constructor, namely the student ID, first name, last name, and course. And then we're going to add the object in the student bank. Else, if the size of the student bank is not 0, or if there is a student, we have to fill up the following class fields: student ID, student's first name, student last name, and student course. Now we are going to use Boolean variable to store if the student number has no duplicate. So if it has a duplicate, it means that it is not valid. So we have here Boolean is not valid equals to false. So we use for loops here, wherein it traverses through the student bank and get the student ID for each object stored. So if a student ID equals to student bank that get student ID, it sets the value the first value, which is false, into true if the duplicate student ID occurred, and then the program will break. Next, conditional statement, where it adds the object to the list if it has no duplicate. So meaning our input is unique. student ID. So we have to check if is not valid, system out print invalid student ID. Else, if the student has a unique student ID, it will be going to confirm as registered. Next, option 2 is for creating new subject record, wherein we create new subject object with its detail and store it in a list of subject objects. Option 2 is creating new student record. First, enter subject ID, which only accepts integer. Second, subject name, which accepts string. Lastly, subject units, which accepts integer. Once finished, added will be printed. Let's look at the code of selection number 2. So again, it creates new subject record. If selected option is 2 is equal to 2 or identical to 2, and if our subject bank doesn't have any inside of it or anything inside, or it's still empty, so we have to fill up the subject class fields again, but this time it's about the subjects. Enter the subject ID, the subject name, and the subject units, which all accepts integer besides the subject name, except it. Next, we created or instantiated an subject object, which is variable name subject, which contains the parameter of subject ID, subject name, and units. Once we are done, confirmation added will be printed. Or else, if we have piled up if there is something inside the subjects, we have to enter the subject ID, subject name, and subject units. So we have here again Boolean data type. Boolean is not valid equals to false. So for every int equals 0, I is less than subject bank, get size, I increment. So if it's not valid is true, the program will break. If else, it will going to print invalid subject ID, and if the subject ID is unique or it doesn't have any duplicate, it will be added as a new subject. And that is my explanation of option 1, create new student record, and option 2, create new student record. To present to you the next options 3 and 4, may we call on Mr. John Christian Albert. Thank you.
For the selection 3 or the end list of the subject to the student, you will see the code. If the subject bank is empty, it will print line the subject list is empty. But if there is a content inside the bank, it will validate your student ID first. Input the student ID. If the ID that you input is matched to the content in the bank, the Boolean variable is valid is set to true. And if the Boolean variable is valid is true, the student info will appear that the match ID entered, and the student will choose a subject that the student will enlist. We will use another Boolean variable, which is exists, to verify if is there a duplication with your subject ID that you enlist. And it's duplicate, it says that it is not valid to have multiple same subject ID in one student. If is exist is true, it will print the subject ID that the ID is already enlisted to this student, and if not, the subject ID that you add will appear to your student info. Then it will print line that enlisted. And if your ID that you input as is not on the list, it will print out the invalid student ID number. And for the selection 4, which is the removal of the subject to the student, the program will validate first or verify the user using the student ID. And then the program will validate the ID in the student bank if there is an ID that will match in the student bank. Then, if the is valid is true, if the student ID match in the student bank, then the Boolean variable is valid, is true. But if not, the is valid will remain false. If the is valid is true, the student can remove a subject if in student. But if the student has no subject in list, there will be print a line that there is no subject enlisted to the student. And if there content inside, it will appear all the subjects that the student have. Once the subject IDs appear, you select the subjects to be removed. Then you have selected one, the program will find the subject IDs until the ID matches the subjects. When the match is found in the student bank that get, it will remove the selected one. Then it will print that your subject is deleted. And here in system output print line, if your ID student is invalid, it will appear the student valid ID is invalid. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. John Christian Albay. And to present to you the remaining options, option 5, 6, 7, and 8, may we call on Mr. Bariring Paul Gabriel.
Um, Here in number 5, it is the condition of the program to display the details of a specific student. The program will ask the user to enter the ID of the student that the user wants to display. We use an if-else statement to check if the ID that the user entered is in the student bank. If the entered ID is equals to one of the recorded students in the student bank, the program will display the details of that student. Number 6, it's just kind of like the number 5, but instead of displaying one student, it will display all of the recorded student details. We use student.bank to get index that gets student details that is in student.java class, and student.bank that get index that gets subject list that is in subject.java class to print the student records. Number 7, this condition will display all student details that is enlisted in a selected subject. We use if-else statement to check if the subject bank size is equal to 0. If the subject bank list is equal to 0, the program will print there are no registered subject Please create subject records before doing so. For else, which means there are a subject record registered, the program will ask the user to enter the subject ID. We also use boolean is found equals false to find if there is a duplicate of subject. Then the program will display the student details that is enlisted in that subject. Um, in number 8, which is the exit, it will terminate the whole program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul Gabriel Barili. May we call on Ms. Noah Cyril Almodovar to sum up and conclude our program.
Again, let's try to run the entire program and input values. Since there were no default student and subject record, we need to register a new one, or else the program will have an error. We cannot also enlist a subject to a student if there were no registered or recorded subject. Let's try to choose option number 3 and it will display the subject list is empty. Also, if we entered a number that is not in the options, for example, number 9, the program will print invalid value. Now let's create a new student record by choosing option number 1. For example, student ID 123. Student's first name Noella Jane. Last name is Rabino. And student's course is BSIT. Now that one student is registered, let's try to register another student by choosing option number 1. For student ID 456. First name Patricia May. Last name Roman. And student's course BSIT. Then let's create a new subject record by choosing option number 2. For subject ID 108. For subject name, Object-Oriented Programming. And for subject units 3. Let's create another subject record. For subject ID 107, subject name Data Structures and Algorithms. Subject unit is 3. With all the information added, we can now enlist a subject to a student by choosing option number 3. The program will ask for a student ID, for example, student ID number 123. After you've entered the student ID, it will display the information of the student you chose. Then the program will let you choose from the registered subjects you want to enlist. Let us enlist subject ID 108 and from the same student ID 123 and from the same student ID 123 enlist 108. Then for another student, 4, 5, 6, let us enlist only one subject, subject 108. After that, let us choose option number 5 to display the updated details of the student. Option number 5 only lets you choose a specific student for the details to be displayed. Let's check for student ID 123, and you will see the two subjects enlisted to that student. Then let's also check for student ID 456 by choosing option number 5. You will see that one subject is enlisted to that student. Now let's try to remove a subject from a student by choosing option number 4. It will again ask for a student ID, for example, student ID 123. It will display the subjects enlisted to that student and lets you choose a subject to be removed by entering the subject ID. Let's remove subject ID 108. Now let us see all of the updated details of the registered students by choosing option number 6. You will see all of the registered students and their enlisted subjects. You can also see that student ID 123 and 456 only have one subject now. That is because we removed one subject from student ID 123 earlier. Now let us choose option number 7 to see the student details enlisted in a specific subject. As we entered option number 7, it will display the subject records. Let us input subject ID 107. And you will see that only student ID 123 have the subject data structures and algorithms. Then lastly, as we enter option number 8, the program will terminate. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Noah Cyril Almodovar. Again, this is Mr. Leo Rodri Humarang together with my group mates. Starting from Mr. John Alday. Next is Ms. Renoa Cyril Almodovar, Mr. Barry Ring Paul Gabriel, Mr. Dolor Charlie, Ms. Rabino Noela Jane, and Ms. Roman Patricia May. Again, this is our midterm project presentation for CCS 108, Object-Oriented Programming, about university or school registration of students and subjects. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation.